Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 188 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Government Purchases Act.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 188 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Government Purchases Act.
Bill 50, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 188 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Government Purchases Act.
The honourable member for Victoria, the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with your permission for an introduction, please.
Please do.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to draw the attention of the House to the West Gallery to my brother Gordon H. Sampson up there, a retired professor, and is here today to observe the proceedings, and I'd like him to receive the warm welcome of the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 199 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Heritage Property Act.
The honourable member for Victoria, the Lakes begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 199 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Heritage Property Act. The honourable member for Kings West.
Bill 51. Okay.
No, just
Bill 51, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 199 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Heritage Property Act.
order this bill be read a second time on a future day. The honourable leader of the opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce an act to amend Chapter 231 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Insurance Act, and Chapter 240 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Judicature Act.
Hear, hear.
The honourable leader of the opposition begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 231 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Insurance Act, and Chapter 240 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Judicature Act.
Bill 53, entitled, Bill 52, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 231 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Insurance Act, and Chapter 240 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Judicature Act.
Order that this bill be read a second time on a future day. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to enter a bill, an act to amend Chapter 3 of the Acts of 1998, the Video Lottery Terminals Moratorium Act.
The honourable member for Kings West begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 3 of the Acts of 1998, the Video Lottery Terminals Moratorium Act.
Bill 53, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 3 of the Acts of 1998, the Video Lottery Terminals Moratorium Act.
Order this bill be read a second time on a future day. The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I have your permission to do an introduction first? Okay, I'm pleased to introduce today in our West Gallery some folks from Pictou County, and they're here today because they're very concerned about the air emission standards at Nova Scotia Power in Trenton. And I'll ask them to rise as I say their names. We have today Peter Boyles, Laura Trowell, and Sharon McDonald, and I'll ask the House to give them a warm welcome, please. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Set Criteria for Prioritizing Road Improvement Projects.
The honourable member for Pictou West begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Set Criteria for Prioritizing Road Improvement Projects. The honourable member for Digby and Mr.
Speaker. Bill 54, entitled An Act to Set Criteria for Prioritizing Road Improvement Projects.
Order this bill be read a second time on a future day. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 4 of the Acts of 1992, the Emergency 911 Act.
The honourable member for Digby-Annapolis begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 4 of the Acts of 1992, the Emergency 911 Act.
Bill 55, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 4 of the Acts of 1992, the Emergency 911 Act.
Ordered this bill be read a second time on a future day. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 6 of the Acts of 2000, the Health Authorities Act.
The honourable member for Glace Bay begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 6 of the Acts of 2000, the Health Authorities Act.
Bill 56, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 6 of the Acts of 2000, the Health Authorities Act.
Ordered that this bill be read a second time on a future day. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act. Thank you.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Bill 57, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Ordered that this bill be read a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. Oh. Revert back. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to enter a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 10 of the Acts of 1994-95, the Workers' Compensation Act.
The honourable member for Kings West begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 10 of the Acts of 1994-95, the Workers' Compensation Act.
Bill 58, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 10 of the Acts of 1994-95, the Workers' Compensation Act.
Ordered that this bill be read a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable Leader in the House for the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on May 8, 2006, Ms. Gladys Bauer of Upper Ohio, Nova Scotia, reached the marvelous age of 108. And whereas this lady has witnessed countless world events spanning more than 100 years and experienced things the rest of us can only hear about. And whereas Ms. Bauer has been and remains an outstanding individual in the community of Upper Ohio. Therefore be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly show their delight and wish Ms. Bauer a very happy 108th birthday. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Pictou Lodge Resort, now celebrating 80 years in business, has come a long way from its original start as Wentworth Lodge back in 1926. And whereas over the years, the Pictou Lodge Resort has had many guests from around the world, including King George V and Princess Juliana of Holland, who stayed at the lodge during World War II. And whereas Pictou Lodge Resort boasts thousands of visitors each year and is well known for oceanside dining, fabulous views, and taste of Nova Scotia approved cuisine and service. Therefore be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the Pictou Lodge Resort owners, the operators and employees on making the lodge such a popular place to stay and dine, and we wish them many more years of success and memory making. And I request waiver of notice.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas West Kings District High School will be celebrating its 50th anniversary in late June with a reunion of former students and staff, and whereas West Kings was one of the first district schools in the province when it opened its doors for the 1956-57 school year, and whereas throughout its 50 years in operation, West Kings has distinguished itself as a leader in many curriculum and extracurricular endeavors, being recognized both provincially and nationally for its achievements. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House congratulate West Kings for 50 years of excellence, both academically, athletics, and music, and wish them every success with the 50-year reunion celebrations. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 2005 saw Nova Scotia lead the way once again as Canada's top seafood exporter at a value of $1.03 billion, and whereas Nova Scotia lobsters accounted for almost 40% of the nearly $1 billion in Canadian lobster exports last year, with the United States remaining our biggest customer. And whereas southwestern Nova Scotia, with Shelburne County at the forefront, accounts for 40% of Canadian lobster stocks. Therefore, be it resolved that all MLAs of this House commend lobster fishermen in southwestern Nova Scotia and all other regions around the province, the Nova Scotia Fishpack Association, and everyone associated with the Nova Scotia seafood export industry, as the industry continues to strive to keep Nova Scotia seafood and most sought after in the world. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the workers at Highland Fisheries in Glace Bay have been locked out by Clearwater Fisheries since March 14th, and whereas efforts to have the Provincial Minister of Fisheries, the Minister of Labour, meet with the employees to try and resolve this lockout have been cast aside by this government, and whereas the Human Resources Development Service Commission has not yet decided whether to award EI benefits to these workers, and the Federal Fisheries Minister has done nothing to try and resolve the matter. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House of Assembly demand the Minister of Fisheries, both provincially and federally, immediately intervene and put these employees back to work and or award them the benefits they deserve. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? I hear a no. The notice is tabled. I heard a no. The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the second annual Inspiring Lives Awards, presented in conjunction with the Mental Health Foundation of Nova Scotia and the Canadian Mental Health Association, was held yesterday in Halifax, and whereas 15 nominees from across Nova Scotia were nominated by various CMHA chapters and organizations, whereas the Kings County chapter was one of those chapters and is well regarded for its work in assisting the surrounding community with its mental health needs and promoting positive attitudes towards mental illness. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House recognize all the nominees and award winners from across Nova Scotia and the work of the Kings County chapter, and in doing so, place importance on mental health awareness during this Mental Health Week. I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Waiver is requested. Is it agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Medical Alert Foundation is a non-profit healthcare information organization dedicated to providing service to people with serious medical conditions. Whereas Medical Alert Repository can connect to and provide critical medical information between patients, providers, payers, and first responders 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, anywhere in the world. Whereas Medical Alert is a non-profit membership organization founded in 1956 with a mission to protect and save lives, and has earned the trust of over 4 million members worldwide. Therefore, be resolved that members of this House of Assembly acknowledge the month May as Medical Alert Awareness Month for this 50th anniversary of saving lives around the globe, and I'd ask for waiver.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Dartmouth-based Environmental Consulting and Contracting Incorporated, or ECCO, recently claimed the Silver Award for Small Business of the Year at the Metro Halifax Business Awards, and whereas ECO is known for its cost-saving and innovative approach to such environmental services as Phase 1, 2, and 3 site assessments, groundwater monitoring, project management services. And whereas the successful company also contributes to its expertise to community projects like supporting recycling programs at elementary schools and providing supplies to those less fortunate. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House sincerely congratulate ECO on their latest honour and for being invited to take part in this month's Team Canada Atlantic Trade Mission to Florida. Businesses such as ECO represent the cutting-edge status of growth and world-class service available in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Waiver request is agreed. All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas yesterday I read a resolution asking the members of this House to recognize the validity of online petitions in view of their rising prevalence and the need for the House of Assembly to move into the 21st century. And whereas this resolution was voted down yesterday by the government, which points clearly to this government's resistance to progress and change, and whereas online petitions bring grassroots democracy to a broad cross-section of people, and the House of Assembly needs to step forward and recognize the importance of any measures that increase public participation. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly condemn the government for its rejection of the principle of online petitions and recognize that this rejection speaks loudly to Nova Scotians of a tired, worn-out government with no willingness to step into the future.
Did the member request waiver?
No.
Notice is tabled. The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Pee Wee B Miners recently won the 10th annual Pee Wee tournament at Westville Miners Sports Centre, and whereas Westville team coaches Delbert Brown, Mike Rankin, and Colin McKenzie guided the team to a 4-3 win over Dartmouth Whalers, and whereas the Pee Wee B team consists of players Blair McLaughlin, Jamie Kerr, Chris Duchman, Alexander Dignan, Jesse Hobley, Norman Kennedy, Kirk Cummings, Lewis Wright, Matt McNaughton, Johnny Evans, Jake Rankin, Brandon McKenzie, Aaron Hemphill, Mason Emery, Brian Sinnis, and Greg Brown. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the Westville Pee Wee B Miners and their coaches on their tournament win and wish them all the best in future games, and I seek waiver of notice.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas seniors have been receiving discounts for years because of having reached the appropriate time in their life where respect should be given, and whereas seniors, having contributed to society through taxes all their working years and continue to do so in retirement, and whereas seniors do not have their income increasing at the current rate of tax increase, heating, fuel, and transportation costs, therefore be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly recognize the need for financial assistance to seniors and call upon government to provide seniors with a yearly pass to use ferries such as at Englishtown, Little Narrows, and LaHave for a small nominal fee. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver and passage without debate.
Request is for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear an A. Recognize the Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas grade 8 Chester area middle school student Antonio Marzetti will fly to Florida in August to compete in the 2006 World Yo-Yo Contest, and whereas the Mill Cove resident is consistently monitored by his mother as she watches out for household items, as Antonio can do practically anything with a yo-yo, including the flying squirrel, the Mach 5, and the Super Boing Boing, while painlessly being able to knock an apple off anyone's head who might be brave enough to step forward. And whereas Antonio will be competing against 200 competitors from across the world while performing his routine to the music from the Will Smith movie Wild Wild West, therefore be it resolved that wishes for a world yo-yo title be extended to Mill Cove's Antonio Marzetti by all members of the House of Assembly while offering our sincerest good luck as he competes. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
There's been a request for a waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Recognize the member for Annapolis. Digby, Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the province of Nova Scotia was built from its coastal fishery, and the downturn in the fishery has caused great out-migration of its people in the last 10 to 15 years. Whereas the fishery of Nova Scotia could be restored to its former state if the will was there to do this, creating triple or more of its present value. And whereas years ago, Iceland and Norway encountered exactly what Nova Scotia has experienced today, and they, in their wisdom, returned their fishery into one of the best in this world. Therefore, be it resolved that this government study Iceland and Norway's effective management of their fishing industry so we can rebuild Nova Scotia's fisheries, taking us out of a have-not province situation. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear a no. The notice is tabled. Recognize the honourable member for Cumberland North, of course.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Alison Forshner, a resident of Wallace Bay, Nova Scotia, and fourth-year university student, has been selected as one of 20 Canadian students to participate in the 2006 International Seminar in Botswana, Africa this summer. And whereas this seminar is a 6-week intercultural exchange that exposes students to the realities of life in a rural community and familiarizes them with international cooperation. And whereas Allison is interested in seeing what rural life will be like in Africa compared to her own rural community, she will participate in a local initiative and undertake a multidisciplinary group research project focusing on HIV/AIDS and local economic development. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join me in sending our congratulations to Allison for being selected for such a prestigious program and representing Canada with enthusiasm and pride. And I respectfully request waiver of notice, Mr. Speaker.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. All in favor signify by saying aye. Contrary minded? Honourable member for Clare. Motion's carried.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 2006 Junior National Racquetball Championships took place in Burlington, Ontario from April 24th to April 29th, and whereas Denise Haynes of Clare placed first in the 18 and under category as well as the 16 and under, which Denise won in 2005, giving her first place finish in these two divisions. And whereas Denise brings honor to the young people and the population of this province, therefore be resolved that this Assembly congratulates Denise Haynes for her accomplishments and wish her every success in the upcoming World Junior Championship in Phoenix, Arizona in December. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver, please.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the term amalgamation is defined as the uniting of two or more organizations to share resources and work towards shared common goals, and whereas on April 1st, 1996, the region of Queens and the town of Liverpool voluntarily joined to form the Region of Queens Municipality, and whereas on April 6, 2006, the municipality celebrated 10 years of sharing and managing departments dedicated to local concerns for residents of our communities, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the Region of Queens Municipality on the 10th anniversary of the amalgamation, and that it may effectively serve Queens residents for many more years to come. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Ryan James O'Rourke of Middleton, Nova Scotia, will be receiving the Chief Scouts Award on May 13, 2006 from the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. And whereas Ryan has been in the Scouting movement for a period of 11 years and has worked diligently to receive this prestigious award by completing at least 6 different challenges in categories such as citizenship, leadership, and personal development, which includes spiritual, intellectual, and physical. And whereas Ryan had to obtain the World Conservation Award, and in order to do so had to complete 2 badges in the environmental category, therefore be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly congratulate Ryan James O'Rourke of Middleton, Nova Scotia for earning his Chief Scouts Award and being an example for all Nova Scotia youth. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas excelling in sport takes great skill, dedication, and endurance, and whereas excelling in more than one sport is very rare, and whereas grade 12 student Ryan Swim of Conquerall Bank, Lunenburg County, has been scouted by a Major League Baseball rep, as well as a variety of Atlantic University basketball coaches. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House extend best wishes and congratulations to athlete Ryan Swim as he plans his successful future in the world of sports. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Earl Dolson has served his community, province, and country for over 33 years, and whereas Mr. Dolson has volunteered his time and effort to various causes over his life, he has brought music into people's lives. His work with the Canadian Legion and his commitment to various organizations throughout the province promoting seniors' issues is an example to all. And whereas it is Mr. Dolson's sense of kindness and compassion to others that has been a driving force behind his work to help improve the lives of others. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House acknowledge the remarkable contribution Earl Dolson has made to his community and wish him many years of continued success. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice, passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day to move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Better Business Bureau honors a business with a Community Achievement Award each year, and whereas these awards are given not only to recognize a company's commitment to the BBB, but to the communities that they serve as a whole. And whereas Vaughan Assurance Limited is the recipient of the award for the Tri-County area for 2006. The company has been a member of the BBB for 19 years and in operation for 40 years with offices in Tuscott, Barrington, and Church Point that employs 22 full-time staff who volunteer their time to many organizations. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join me in congratulating Vaughan Assurance Limited and its owner, Eddie Madden, and to all their dedicated staff for their commitment to their community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 29 students of grade 8 class of St. Michael's School in Glace Bay have raised money to purchase toys for the pediatric ward of the Cape Breton Regional Hospital. Whereas one of the students recently was at the hospital and noticed the need for new toys and decided to bring the matter to the attention of her teacher and classmates, the students sold pizza, collected recyclables, and set up a coat check at the school dance to raise more than $300. Whereas the grade 8 students take on a project every year focused on giving back to the community as part of the class curriculum. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly congratulate St. Michael's Junior High School grade 8 French Social Studies students, as well as their teacher, Mrs. Lisa Roach, for both their generosity of spirit and on a job well done. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Clayton Park Junior High Wildcats captured their third Capital Zone Hockey Championship in February, defeating their Fairview Junior High rivals by a score of 6-3 in a 2-game total goal format. And whereas the championship capped off an undefeated season for the Wildcats, who finished with an 11-0 record. And whereas coaches Russell Walker and Sid Moore have enthusiastically volunteered their time for many years to ensure that the students have the chance to play junior high hockey. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate the Clayton Park players and coaches for their winning season in 2005-06 and wish them continued success in the future. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the province is flush with excess amount of funds, promising millions of dollars a day since March the 1st, 2006, and whereas education is the cornerstone of a respectful, civilized society and necessary for the development of our children's future, and whereas this government must recognize that big is not always better and education is the right of every community and taxpayer, therefore be it resolved that members of this House of Assembly call upon the government to provide the necessary funds to immediately repair and refurbish Balls Creek School and show their commitment to allow this school to reopen for classes by September 2006. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, I hear a no. The notice is tabled. The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas there are 253,000 volunteers in the province of Nova Scotia, each giving approximately 200 hours of their time to make our communities a better place to live. And whereas Nova Scotia volunteers give more time to their province than any other volunteers in this country, and whereas our Nova Scotian volunteers are more dedicated by staying with an organization longer than any other volunteers in this country, therefore it be resolved that the members of this House of Assembly applaud all of our volunteers and work to make them feel more appreciated. Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver, please.
Request for waiver, is it agreed?
Great.
All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. Before proceeding, I do want to say on one of the notices of motion brought forward to the House this afternoon by the member for Halifax Clayton Park about electronic petitions, that motion is out of order because it talked about a decision of the House, and it was in fact referring to a notice. It was not voting down a decision. So I just note the clerks to record such. And now recognize the leader in the House for the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, you have been previously provided with a copy of this motion before the time requirements. Mr. Speaker, I hereby serve notice as per section 43(2) of the Rules and Forms of Procedure of the House of Assembly with a request for this House to entertain an emergency debate. Speaker, I move that the business of the House be set aside for the purpose of discussing a matter of urgent public importance. The matter is as follows. Stora Enso, one of the largest companies in Nova Scotia, is currently involved in a severe labour dispute, which has seen the plant shut down for some time now, forcing many workers out of work. Unfortunately, there is no end in sight to the lockout. Given the extremely large scale of the Point Tupper plant, there are several major economic effects which cannot be ignored, and if the lockout continues, it will be devastating to the local and provincial economy. Each month the labour dispute continues. The province is losing out on $750,000 in income tax revenue. Nova Scotia Power is losing roughly $4 million per month. This lost revenue will undoubtedly be put on the backs of consumers by power rate increases. And the company is losing, Stora itself is losing almost $6 million per day in potential revenue. Mr. Speaker, the spin-off effects of the already lengthy closure have been felt around the province, especially in the Strait area. The Cape Breton and Central Nova Scotia Railway has been forced to lay off employees. The North Inverness Forest Management Cooperative has warned that they will be forced to lay off individuals in the Communications, Energy and Paperworkers Local 972 if the dispute cannot be resolved shortly. We have word now that as recently as yesterday, the two sides have been brought back to the table, but talks broke down after only 2 hours of discussion as they still have not been able to reach necessary compromises. Mr. Speaker, this is all deeply troubling for myself as Mayor from Richmond and for, I believe, our entire province. Each day that continues to go by, several workers are home without paychecks, and the spin-off effects to the regional and provincial economy are extraordinary. We can no longer sit by without this issue being debated at full by our legislature. Mr. Speaker, we know that the company has told the government and has told the opposition parties that it needs stable power rates and a new tax structure along with a new labour agreement before they will reopen the mill. Mr. Speaker, the government to date has failed to act on these issues. Mr. Speaker, this labour dispute requires immediate attention, and I would ask that you would rule favourably on my request for an emergency debate. Thank you.
I have received the motion according to the rules and forms of procedure for the House of Assembly. I've considered the motion. While there are matters outside the jurisdiction of this House, there are impacts that are of urgency to many Nova Scotians. Therefore, I rule that the motion is proper to be discussed. There is a motion before the House that an emergency debate be considered. Is it the will of the House that the motion be considered? Yes. This debate shall commence following the regular business of the day and shall replace the late debate. Orders of the day. Oral questions put by members. Question period shall commence at 3:33 p.m. and finish at 4:33 p.m. Recognize the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Today, this government presented a document that contains a number of promises to the people of the province. It acts on some, though not all, of the promises made in last Thursday's throne speech. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I'm encouraged to see that the long campaign by so many Nova Scotians like John Hill, the Pictou County Council, CBRM Council, the Golden K Kiwanis Club, our caucus, and many others to have the HST removed from heating source shows some promise of coming to a close. And I use the word promise very deliberately, Mr. Speaker, and this brings me to my question. I ask the Premier, will he commit to bring this budget to a vote so that consumers can realize these long-awaited HST savings before calling an election?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Leader of the Opposition for the question. Mr. Speaker, the budget document table today has a number of priority areas for the government, one of those being the relief on the HST. And Mr. Speaker, what I can assure that member and all Nova Scotians, that is our intention to ensure that Nova Scotians receive that benefit.
The Leader of the Opposition on his first supplemental.
Mr. Speaker, this is not the time for the Premier to dance around the question, so I want to be clear. It's been a decade. It's been a decade since the unfair, unethical tax was applied by the Liberals, and nearly as long since the Ham Conservatives first campaigned against it. Consumers have waited for years and paid hundreds of millions of dollars in HST on heating. Making them wait even longer for inexplicable reasons is not what they deserve. I know that anyone who intends to keep their promises will use any reasonable opportunity they encounter to do so. For the Premier, that opportunity is here in this House with these budget documents. So my question is, Mr. Premier, will you guarantee that this budget is brought to a vote through the normal budget process later this month?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition should know by now that those on this side of the House don't make promises. We make commitments. And we keep commitments, Mr. Speaker, and we will keep this commitment to the people of Nova Scotia.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My recollection is that the list of broken promises and commitments is long and undistinguished, Mr. Speaker. And unless and until this budget is brought to a vote in this House and judgment passed on the many initiatives that it seeks to pursue, it will be nothing more than words on a page, promises in print. leadership requires that those placed in positions of influence use that power to the benefit of their constituents and those they represent. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is will the Premier put his written commitment to remove the HST from home heating into law through this budget? Or will he leave yet another question mark hanging over Conservative promises?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we have made a commitment to the people of Nova Scotia, and I can assure you we will keep that commitment, and we will keep many other commitments. We will keep the commitment to invest more in our highways and infrastructure. We will keep our commitment to adding $200 million to the healthcare system. We will keep our commitment to low-income families in Nova Scotia, and we will keep many, many other commitments in the days ahead.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, in February of this year, 2006, the Tory party celebrated the legacy of the former Premier, the now MLA for Pictou Centre. Mr. Speaker, they highlighted his legacy of fiscal prudence. More importantly, his stand that gas regulation was bad for Nova Scotia, that he could not raise the basic personal exemption, and that he could not remove the provincial portion of the HST from home heating oil. Mr. Speaker, how things have changed in 3 months, because new government has flip-flopped on all three of these issues. So my question to the Premier is, at what point did you decide that the former Premier, the MLA for Pictou Centre, was wrong on gas regulation, HST on oil, and raising the basic personal exemption?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member the member is speaking of is the same member who brought $830 million here to our province to put it towards our debt. It's the same member that balanced the books in our province for 4 consecutive years, Mr. Speaker. It's the same member we're proud to have called our leader and our Premier during the past 6.5 years to put a foundation in for Nova Scotians for the future, and we will build upon that foundation, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the Liberal Party on his first supplemental.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the way they're flip-flopping on the issues that were first decided by the former Premier, one can only wait to see what else that they'll decide suddenly is no longer in favour for the Tory party. Mr. Speaker, it's unfortunate that under the rules of our House that I'm unable to even ask the member for Pictou Centre to tell us exactly what he thinks of today's budget. And maybe the media will have the opportunity to see what his legacy was celebrated in February and what he's left with today. Mr. Speaker, the decision suddenly, Mr. Speaker, to raise the basic personal exemption was announced, and the Minister of Finance told us that he missed the deadline from Revenue Canada, just like they missed the deadline in 2003 for the 10% tax cut. We now hear that only this morning did they meet with bulk retailers of oil to talk about removing the provincial portion of the HST. Mr. Speaker, it is clear that these are not well thought out decisions, but they're policy on the fly. And will the Premier admit today that these are only knee-jerk policy flip-flops leading into a provincial election?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the document that the Minister of Finance put forward today focused on the priorities of this government, and I believe focused on the priorities of Nova Scotians. It finds a balance between lowering our taxes for our families and for our students and for individuals across our province, whether it be on personal income tax or otherwise. It finds a balance between growing the economy and lowering our taxes and investing in much-needed infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, it is a type of document which I believe Nova Scotians believe is the right document for this time, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue to make the right decisions for the right reasons. When we make a decision to go in our budget or when we make a decision on a daily basis, we do so ensuring that we maintain our balanced approach, maintain a balanced budget, and with the best interest possible of all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, and we will continue with that.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the Liberal Party on your final supplementary.
Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians remember all too well the last time that the Tories came promising tax cuts prior to an election, only to see what happened as soon as they were voted back into government when they rescinded that tax cut. Now, Mr. Speaker, here we are in 2006, and once again, the Tory party of Nova Scotia comes bearing gifts for Nova Scotians. So my question is, will the Premier assure Nova Scotians that his budget will be fully debated and voted on prior to an election call?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you it's fully our intention. We've put a budget in place. It's fully our intention for Nova Scotians to receive their healthy living tax credit. It's fully our intention to give them the graduate tax credit, the child care benefit tax credit, the tax rate on used motor vehicles, the large corporation capital tax, and the many other initiatives put forward in this budget, Mr. Speaker. I can make the commitment to the honourable member that we will do that this year, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I can see the Premier's got his message tracked down, Pat, but it's not very enlightening, really. My question is for the Premier. Last Thursday, Nova Scotia post-secondary students were encouraged to hear a promise from this Conservative government to deal with the highest tuitions in the country. Let me remind the House of the numbers we're dealing with here. Tuition in Nova Scotia is 50% above the national average, a staggering $6,200 per year. This makes Nova Scotia not only the least affordable place in Canada to get an education, but also the least affordable in North America. Tackling this problem is no small feat, and this is not a government that has shown any willingness to make post-secondary education more affordable. They have, in fact, made it much less affordable. So my question for the Premier is, why would you make a promise last week when you knew you were not going to keep it this week?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we have made a commitment to the students here in our province, Mr. Speaker, and it is our intention to keep that commitment over a 5-year period. Mr. Speaker, you can't do everything all at once in government. You have to make decisions which are in the best interest within budgetary your means. Now, the NDP may not realize that, Mr. Speaker, and I can fully understand that, but we will keep that commitment.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition, on your first supplemental.
Well, Mr. Speaker, for those listening to the Conservatives' throne speech last week, it seemed clear that tuition would be rolled back this year. Instead, Mr. Speaker, it will increase by at least another $250. Breaking faith with people is a decision not to be taken lightly in any circumstance, but breaking faith with students and their families so quickly and clearly undermines the very credibility of this government. So my question for the Premier is this: will the Premier tell this House how he can justify forcing tuition even higher, pushing post-secondary education further out of the reach of Nova Scotia families?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, we were very clear in our commitment last week in the throne speech with regards to getting our tuitions within the range, Mr. Speaker, of the national average over the next 5 years. We're very clear in our commitment as well, along with a number of other initiatives, about making it more, giving more opportunity through student loans to increasing the threshold by 25%, by providing more opportunity to our students through our student debt relief program, and giving them more opportunity to stay here at home in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, there's not just one or two initiatives. There are a number of initiatives for our students in this document and in our throne speech. And I can assure that member and all members that when we make those commitments, we take them seriously and we will keep those commitments.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition, on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Students from rural areas are 3 times less likely than those from urban areas to pursue a post-secondary education. Those from low-income backgrounds are less likely to seek a post-secondary education if their parents did not pursue one. And I remind the House that this budget does not reverse the practice brought in by this government that prevents single parents on social assistance from getting ahead through an education. So my question is, why does the Premier refuse to recognize the value of a post-secondary education and fulfill his promise to reduce the cost of tuition in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to give further clarity in this issue, I will refer to the Minister of Education to highlight some of our initiatives, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this government's commitment to post-secondary education is really unparalleled in this country. Mr. Speaker, I want to tell you that we've not only increased the funding for the universities and for the community college, we have also, my colleague, the Minister of Finance, introduced a number of measures today that talked about adjustment to the student loan program, which will actually see, Mr. Speaker, the student takes advantage of all those things. Coupled with the Millennium Scholarship, 65% of a Nova Scotia student loan can be reduced or can be forgiven if all of the options are accepted. And Mr. Speaker, there is no other province in the country, as far as I know, that does that. And the other thing, Mr. Speaker, I want to tell the honourable member this government understands that the tuition fees are high, and that's why we made a commitment over a 5-year period to get them down to the national average. But I wanted to tell one other thing, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Minister.
This province has the highest at post-secondary level province in this country.
The Honourable, the Liberal House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question today is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, back in 1991, Nova Scotia ended its policy of gas regulation, and at that time, this province had the highest gas prices in the country. Apparently, this Premier is prepared to walk down the same road again. Back in the fall, this legislature commissioned a study to be completed on gas regulation. The study concluded that gas regulation would not provide Nova Scotians with lower prices relative to a competitive market. And Mr. Speaker, the now Premier, along with many other ministers, all declared that gas regulation would not work in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, this was only months ago. What has changed since then? Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is, do you disagree with the findings in the study that you and the Cabinet spent over $100,000 of taxpayers' money on?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we would be the only province east of Ontario not to be regulated in this area, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we want to ensure that we provide greater stability to consumers, to the consumers of Nova Scotia. This will do that, Mr. Speaker. In addition to that, it will also give, Mr. Speaker, further opportunities for our independent stations out in rural parts of Nova Scotia, many in the members from the other side's riding. Mr. Speaker, the government takes this issue very seriously. Yes, Mr. Speaker, a great deal of time and effort has taken place in reviewing this, but the government made a decision which they felt was in the best interest of the consumers and the taxpayers of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, what's in the best interest is for the government as it heads to an election to try to give the perception of Nova Scotians that they're going to get something here, when in effect, Mr. Speaker, what they're going to get is higher gas prices. Mr. Speaker, the Premier himself does not believe that gas regulation will provide lower prices, and he said that. If you ask Nova Scotians, what they want is not some false sense of stability. They want lower prices. We all know that. We all know what the answer to that question would be if they're asked. Consumers want lower prices and always will. Mr. Speaker, this Premier is sacrificing the pocketbooks of Nova Scotians for a false sense of stability and for his perceived political gain. Mr. Speaker, he knows this is the wrong thing to do, and he said so in the past. My question, first supplementary to the Premier, Mr. Premier, yes or no, will gas regulation provide higher prices at the pumps for the consumers of this province?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I've said from day one, there is a price to stability, Mr. Speaker. That is fact, and I've said that, and I stand here today and I say that. But, Mr. Speaker, stability is very important, and the people of Nova Scotia want to have that stability. There will be days where the gas prices will be lower. There will be other days where the gas prices will be higher, Mr. Speaker. That is the reality under a regulated environment.
The Honourable Liberal House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, what this Premier is saying is that higher gas prices are okay in Nova Scotia. He just said that once again.
That's good for
He said that
tourism.
higher gas prices are okay. Mr. Speaker, in Nova Scotia, gas prices are ranging anywhere from $1.11 per litre to $1.15 per litre. In PEI, and this is yesterday's figures, in PEI, gas prices are ranging from $1.18 a litre to $1.22 a litre. In a regulated market today, the prices are generally 7 cents per litre greater than in our competitive market. Mr. Premier, consumers are not willing to pay an extra 7 cents a litre, which you consider is okay for your personal political agenda. My question to the Premier, why are you prepared to sacrifice the pocketbooks of Nova Scotians for political gain by implementing a plan which you yourself said would make consumers pay more in gas prices?
The Honourable the Premier.
I refer that to the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and through you to the member opposite. I can tell him that this government has listened to Nova Scotians. Nova Scotians and businesses across this province have said they want stability in this province. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you yesterday, driving up from Yarmouth, gasoline was $1.17.9. When I got here in the city, it was $1.11.9. People across this province want stability. This government is going to give them stability, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is once again for the Premier. We know that there have been many promises made by this government in the documents tabled in the House today. And one of these promises deals with the long-known need for long-term care beds for the elderly ill. These beds are required so that seniors who have worked their entire lives, paid taxes, contributed to their communities, can live out the rest of their lives in comfort and dignity. This budget, however, makes no short-term relief available to the many seniors currently awaiting placement in a nursing home. Will the Premier confirm that under his budget, no additional long-term care beds will be built this year or next?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as we highlighted in our budget, we will see 1,300 new beds over the next 10 years, Mr. Speaker, which is very good news for the people of our province. 1,300, Mr. Speaker. It's a huge commitment, which means, Mr. Speaker, $16 million in this year alone. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health will be outlining the continuing care strategy tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, and all of those details will be made available.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition, on your first supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, yes. How can this government justify further delaying the beds that are needed is beyond me, Mr. Speaker. It's hard to fathom just how this Premier and his government can accept an additional $500 million in revenue next year without placing a priority on building the needed nursing home beds. In Shelburne, in Clare, in Cape Breton, the North Shore, HRM, and all across the province, the needs are growing. Mr. Speaker, my question is this. Why has the government failed to meet the immediate needs of seniors requiring long-term care and the longer waits in emergency rooms and for surgery that result as a result of your delay?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, nothing could be further from the truth. The continuing care strategy, Mr. Speaker, will be released tomorrow. It will outline, Mr. Speaker, the government's priorities for this year and in the years ahead. Mr. Speaker, it will focus on seeing more long-term care beds, expanded home support services, and a number of other initiatives, Mr. Speaker. But the Minister of Health will outline all of those details tomorrow.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition, on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not everyone in the province knows is that the number of long-term beds are actually fewer than they were when this government came to power. Everything in this budget, Mr. Speaker, is about choices. This government made a choice to cut the number of beds, and now they are making a choice to leave hundreds of seniors and people with serious disabilities waiting for nursing home beds that just aren't there. So my question is this. Why was an increase in the number of nursing home beds so important that it was a major Conservative promise in 1999, but now it is apparently so unimportant to you?
The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Health.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I find it entertaining that the member opposite is bringing this up now. These are very important things that we've been working very, very, very diligently on in the last 5 years to find the right services for our communities and for our seniors. We take our seniors very seriously and want to make sure that they have the home care supports that they deserve, that they have the monies that they deserve to take care of their own destinies, that they have the long-term care beds that they require. Let's do the right thing for Nova Scotians. Let's take care of our seniors.
The Honourable Member for Halifax, Chebucto.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. My question will be for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, today there are termination notices going to more than 200 households in the Valley community of Cornwallis. The Shaw Group has announced the closure of its subsidiary Shaw Wood effective July 31st. This manufacturing facility has been in operation for the past 7 years. There will be 200 former working families gathering around the supper table tonight, wondering what their futures hold. There will be 200 former working families wondering if they can continue to live in their home communities. Mr. Speaker, I ask the Premier, what will his government be doing for these families?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. And as this falls under the purview of the Minister of Economic Development, I will refer to him to answer the question.
Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member opposite for the question. This certainly is a sad announcement that has taken place today, and there certainly are some workers whose future is in question. But I would like to assure the member opposite and the workers that the government, along with Nova Scotia Business Inc., the community, and all the entities that are involved, will be working very hard to look for new employment for those individuals.
Honourable member for Halifax-Shabukto on your first supplementary.
Well, sympathy won't do it, Mr. Speaker. I note that in today's budget speech, it says that the Conservatives will help the forest industry to grow. And the budget repeats the old Conservative promise about an increase in value-added production. Well, we know that the pulp and paper industry is in big trouble, and now a manufacturing business based on our forests is closing up. Yet there is no specific measure for the forest industry in a budget that tries very hard to suggest that all is well in Nova Scotia. Again, to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, where do the 200 former employees of Shaw Wood fit into these Conservative promises to grow the forest industry?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Economic Development.
Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I mentioned before, there certainly are challenges that we face, and there certainly are challenges within the forest industry. And we will work with each individual group to look at everything that we can possibly do for them, and we will look for employment for those individuals, and we'll do all that we can to ensure that the industry can rebound and can become healthy and vibrant again.
Honourable member for Halifax-Shabukto on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, again to the Premier. Sir, it is clear that we're dealing with an industry that in all parts of this province is going to be in big trouble. It's clearer than ever that this is a government long on promises but short on action to keep those promises. These families affected today will apparently just be the latest victims of a government's ad hoc approach. Mr. Speaker, what does the Premier have to say to these employees and their families about his government's failure to keep its long-standing promises to build a sustainable, value-added forestry sector in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Economic Development.
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, we will be doing everything with the forest industry that we possibly can. As the member opposite would know, there are certainly challenges throughout Canada and throughout North America, and we are there with that industry, and we will be working with them to get them back to prosperity.
The Honourable Member for Digby-Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I didn't seem to understand that answer, and I've got to ask it myself, because this wood plant, this furniture plant is in my riding, and 200 people down there we don't need out of work, because the main employer right now seems to be the funeral homes anyway. And if it keeps going that way, there's going to be more room for more funeral homes. That's all there's going to be in Digby and Annapolis. So we don't need to lose that. What is the government going to do for this vital industry of Digby and Annapolis? I heard the answer from the Economic Development Minister. I would like to hear that answer from the Premier, please. Thank you.
The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Economic Development.
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, we'll be doing everything we can, and that will also include working with the community, working with the member opposite who has asked the question, who I know his heart is with those individuals and those employees, and together we will do everything we possibly can to assist them in any way.
The Honourable Member from Digby-Annapolis on your first supplementary.
I believe there's more problems coming than Cornwallis Park, too, for export industry in this province. And I think a lot of it's the cause of the Canadian dollar going up. And we're going to see bigger problems in our export business. Does this government, and this question is to the Premier, does this government have a plan in place for the rising dollar and the exports that we need to export from this province, including our fishery?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and certainly I want to add to the Minister of Economic Development's comments. It's a very unfortunate situation that the employees face right now with Shaw. And it's very unfortunate for the region, it's very unfortunate for their families, Mr. Speaker, and we certainly recognize that. And the Minister and his staff and NSBI and others are working very closely and have been working very closely with Shaw to ensure that we do everything we can to help those individuals out. Mr. Speaker, what I will say is, as the member would have noticed in today's budget document, it does talk about an export strategy. And Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Minister of Economic Development would be more than happy to expand upon that program with the honourable member.
The honourable member for Digby-Annapolis and your final supplementary.
To the Premier again, Mr. Speaker. It seems like there was some help for a potato farm in this province not long ago, and there was some help for Magic Valley Fun Farm or whatever it is. Is there some help immediately for this plant in Cornwallis?
The Honourable, the Premier.
I refer that to the Minister of Economic Development.
Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the member opposite for the question. As the member would know, the manufacturer up in the park had one client, and that client has gone in other places for the services. So that greatly limits the ability that we have at this point in time to be able to assist or to be able to bring those jobs back.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Health. Since the 1970s, the residents of Western Shelburne County have been waiting for a nursing home in their community, Mr. Speaker. A committee was formed 6 years ago and is asking this government for a 50-bed nursing home. They're tired of watching their seniors being sent out of the region in order to receive nursing home care, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this year, they were told by this government that they could get a 12 to 16-bed expansion in the community. But a recent letter from the Minister of Health stated that that will not happen now, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Minister of Health, why is this community and the residents of Shelburne County been misled with an earlier offer up to 16 beds and now have it removed from the table, Mr. Speaker?
Whoa, 16 beds.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for his concern for Shelburne County. I do want to also underline the issue that we have not said no. We were talking about a continuing care strategy to be released tomorrow, which will have more details on where we'll be making our investment in beds. And at that point, we can retake up the negotiation with Bayside on an expansion to that facility. And that's the go forward. So if they read into that letter that we said no, that is exactly false. They're reading between the lines for some reason for words that are not there.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to quote from this letter, and I'll table it for the members of this House. And I quote, "The proposal for additional beds in the facility has not yet been considered." What does that mean to you, Mr. Speaker, that the people in this community, in this region of the province, are still waiting for long-term care beds so that they don't have to send their seniors out of the region, out of the area where they have their support and their families, Mr. Speaker? So I ask the Minister of Health, why is his government completely ignoring the needs of residents, not only in all of Nova Scotia for long-term care, Mr. Speaker, but especially for Western Shelburne County?
Hear, 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 hear.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I just want to underline that there's only a number of people that have been working on this for a very long time to ensure that the proper bed representation is there in each region. The member for Shelburne has been working very diligently on this one and working with me to make sure that we have the correct decisions there. The continuing care strategy will be out tomorrow. We'll talk about our investments in that area, and the negotiations can continue. I always said at this time when that letter was sent that we can't talk about where our bed's going to go until the strategy is released. They talk about planning. They compare. I remember in a speech, I remember in a comment in last night's dissertation from the member from Richmond that says, "Where's your plan? How come there's no plan?" We put together a plan, and they're criticizing us for that. I don't understand it, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, South Shore Regional and the Yarmouth Regional hospitals are experiencing huge pressures, leading to the expulsion of 75 seniors from the area to nursing homes in other regions of the province, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, more nursing home beds are needed in this region, and it was needed yesterday, Mr. Speaker. I asked the Minister of Health, why have the seniors in Western Shelburne County been told they must wait for treatment in long-term care facilities that could take up to 20 years to address the problems, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I can say that I am absolutely excited to have a continuing care strategy coming forward tomorrow that favors, that actually takes care of our seniors, ones that are so important to our community. We'll be taking care of them. Find out tomorrow.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health as well. You know, Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of francophones in the counties of Yarmouth and Digby, and many of them, when they are elderly, have to go to nursing homes. And many of those, Mr. Speaker, under the single entry system, are being sent far distances away to nursing homes that are Anglophone, where they don't speak French, Mr. Speaker. And this obviously is, they cannot communicate at these nursing homes. They're elderly, they're obviously very ill, Mr. Speaker, and clearly there's a lot of trauma to these elderly francophones from those two particular counties, Mr. Speaker. And recently, Villa Acadien has asked specifically for 10 beds in the Meteghan area where they have a nursing home, Mr. Speaker, in order to ensure that these elderly francophones from that part of the province have an opportunity to stay in their community and have the services provided for them in French, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Minister of Health is, why did he reject the request from Villa Acadien for 10 new beds in Meteghan so that francophone services can be provided to francophone elderly people in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member opposite for underlining this very important issue. Back in the fall, I think we're almost a year ago, the member for Clare, the member for Richmond, as well as other community groups brought up the issue of our Acadians having to go to different regions in order to get long-term care. And I can say that the Minister of Acadian Affairs at that time wrote a letter to the Minister, then Minister of Health, underlining that very concern. And I want to make sure that tomorrow, in tomorrow's continuing care strategy, that issue will be addressed.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage on your first supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I'm just waiting for him to say soon, very soon, and we'll all know exactly what's going to come out. You know, Mr. Speaker, there's an example of one elderly francophone who was sent to the Annapolis Valley because it was within 100 kilometers of the home of the elderly person. And as she was dying, she wanted last rites, Mr. Speaker, and they couldn't find a priest in the area who spoke French to be able to provide her with that. And to me, you know, for our seniors who are dying and who are ill and are in these long-term care facilities, Mr. Speaker, you know, they deserve dignity. And that's not what they're receiving under the current system. And it's quite disturbing. So it's been a number of years since we've had the single entry system, Mr. Speaker. I want to ask the Minister of Health, when are we going to see a comprehensive review of that system to ensure it's working for all Nova Scotians?
The Honourable, the Minister of Health.
I tell you, they keep asking the same questions, and I want to thank him for the question and how important that is. And I also want to say that we visited Villa Acadienne just the other day. The Premier had the opportunity to tour that wonderful facility. I had the opportunity to tour that wonderful facility as well. You know, we're going in there and trying to have investments into long-term care. We'll be talking about those policies and those issues tomorrow in the continuing care strategy.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, you know, the Minister of Health, when he was Minister, I assume he's still Minister of Acadian Affairs, you know, we worked hard on getting a French Services Act in this province to ensure that we reflect the rights of francophones in this province, both to have services in their native language and to ensure they can do it close to home, Mr. Speaker. And one of the problems, and I think it's pretty ironic about this particular situation, is that the Villa Acadien in Meteghan has a number of Anglophones at the facility who don't speak French. And the services are predominantly in French at that nursing home, Mr. Speaker. So I would suggest to you that the system clearly has problems. So I want to ask this minister, Mr. Speaker, when will there be a review of the single entry access system to ensure that we reflect both the cultural issues and linguistic issues before we decide to ship someone 100 kilometers away to a community that is distant both culturally, linguistically, and obviously geographically? The
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And not to let go everything that we have in our continuing care strategy, but the SIA or the single entry access program will be talked about, and how to enhance it, how to make it better. That'll be in there. The Francophone issue will be in there, and building more beds in Nova Scotia and having more services for our seniors will be in that strategy tomorrow.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, during last year's budget, this government committed $1.65 million to add 50 restorative care beds in Nova Scotia. On February 13th of this year, government finally issued a tender call for these beds on March 8th. The award date of the tender was then cancelled, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, despite the fact that this was promised in last year's budget, they failed to deliver on that promise. So my question to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, is why did you, Mr. Minister, fail to deliver on the 50 restorative care beds that was promised in last year's budget?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and just want to give an idea that the RFP was cancelled as the Evaluation Selection Committee determined that the desirable criteria, we couldn't actually compare submissions to submissions. So we wanted to be assured that we have the right issue. We committed to 50 restorative beds. We will deliver on 50 restorative beds.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on your first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you know, the minister's response is not acceptable. This government said last year that 50 restorative care beds would be added to the system while the assessment of the province's continuing care and alternative levels of care was being completed. Mr. Speaker, this government promised to deliver while the review was going on, not to bundle up last year's announcement into this year's plan. So, Mr. Speaker, my question again to the minister. Why did you, Mr. Minister, cancel the tender that would have delivered 50 restorative care beds that were promised in last year's budget?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
And I've said before is that we have a commitment to 50 restorative beds, some of them being in the Cape Breton region, of course, and we're going to continue to do the work and be diligent that make sure that those beds that are so very important to our population will be put in place. We committed to it, and we will honour that commitment.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Minister, you did not deliver on it. You did not. You made a promise and you did not deliver on that promise. Mr. Speaker, there's an old adage. It goes like this: fool me once, shame on you. But fool me twice, and shame on me. Mr. Speaker, that's how Nova Scotians will view today's budget, and that's how they will view future promises as they relate to that government. Mr. Speaker, my question again to the Minister of Health. Why should Nova Scotians believe what you are saying today and what you're going to say tomorrow when you failed to deliver on last year's budget promises?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Again, Mr. Speaker, they talk about planning and doing due diligence and making sure that we make the right decisions for the right reasons. That is why this has been delayed. We will commit to the 50 beds. There will be more talk about it in the continuing care strategy tomorrow, and I'll be looking forward to bring that forward. We committed. We will deliver on that commitment.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Environment and Labour. You know, Mr. Minister, this marks a terrible day in our history in this province, Mr. Speaker. This is the 14th anniversary of the West Ray tragedy, where 26 miners lost their lives. Following that disaster, Mr. Speaker, a judicial inquiry led by Justice Richards brought forward extensive recommendations that would have protected workers in Nova Scotia. These regulations were ignored by the former Liberal government, and after almost 7 years have been doing nothing but gathering dust with those guys over there. So I want to ask this minister, why have you ignored the recommendation of a well-respected jurist like Judge Richards and turned your back on the working women and men of this province?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as in my resolution earlier, I did mention and acknowledge what West Ray has meant to this province. And occupational health and safety measures are a joint measure. They're a measure that needs to be shared by the employees, the employers, and the community as a whole. We have taken this occupational health and safety standards way into the future, and we will continue to do that, working with communities and employees.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, since 2003, 37% of the budget in the OHS officers have been cut. That's not taking things seriously, Mr. Speaker. In her former position as Minister of Public Service, she ignored the hiring irregularities, such as applicants being given answers to interview questions. This was wrong, but the really large problem with this was for OH&S officers. Officers that are supposed to look after the safety of workers at workplaces, Mr. Speaker. This lack of due diligence in her old job and lack of response in her current position is putting Nova Scotian workers at risk and creating a pall over the workers that she represents down at the Department of Environment and Labour. So I want to ask you, Mr. Minister, why don't you do the right thing? Tell this House Minister, who gave out those answers, and get rid of the scoundrels.
The Honourable Madam Minister of Environment and Labour.
Well, I would like to thank the Madam Member opposite, and I will continue by saying that this government is committed to occupational health and safety in this province. When irregularities were picked up in that audit, there was a complete audit carried out, and that audit was acted on.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre on your final supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, her attempt at comedic relief was pitiful, and the answer in general was pitiful. Mr. Speaker, this tragedy was compounded by a former Tory Premier who blamed the workers for that problem at Westray, and you should know that, Minister. There's been nothing done since successive Conservative governments have been in power. Now there's a rumour that we'll be going to the polls soon, and we just wonder what's going to be done for the families of that 26 miners, or workers like Yancy Myers, who died in a convenience store in Antigonish, or Kenneth James Purcell, who was murdered while driving a cab on Christmas Day. So, Minister, if it's working so well, tell me what you're doing.
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, and as part of Environment and Labour's business plan this year, we have recognized violence in the workplace. It is something that we have named it in the business plan. We will continue to work with it. Again, occupational health and safety in this province will continue to be on this government's radar, and we will continue to work with individuals.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question again is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, we've seen this Premier and his cabinet over the past couple of months continue to hide and conceal documents. We've seen them refuse to answer questions. This has all been done under the secret veil of cabinet confidentiality. Mr. Speaker, it seems evident they are still living up to their recent award for the most secret government in Canada. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians want answers to their questions, and they deserve to know the truth about these two grants that the Tory cabinet decided to give out to their friends S&J Potato Farms and Magic Valley. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier, Mr. Premier, will you commit today to the full disclosure of the documents requested in the Public Accounts Committee's warrant?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the member brought up economic development. I'll refer that to the Minister of Economic Development.
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question, but I guess I can answer it by saying, you know, we had the lawyers and people in the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy go through documents, do what they felt was necessary, and process those documents and pass them along to the people who had requested them. I've never viewed those documents until after they've gone through and been made aware of them by the opposition, but we did everything according to the laws that we have, and we abided by the laws to protect people's privileges.
Honourable Member for Cape Breton South in your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Office of Economic Development Minister is now becoming the chief apologist for the Cabinet, I guess. So let me try this question on the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the Premier of this province, who was then the Minister of Tourism, received advice back in 2003 not to give financial assistance to Magic Valley. The Minister of OED received that same advice in 2004 and again in 2005. Yet still this Premier and his Cabinet decided to give taxpayers' money away to political friends. It seems evident to me what they are trying to hide. This Cabinet made a bad deal for Nova Scotia and they're trying to cover it up. My question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, yes or no, do you believe that a $350,000 grant to a company who already owes this government $220,000 is a good way to spend taxpayers' money?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Economic Development.
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, we invest money in Nova Scotia on a regular basis and will continue to invest money in Nova Scotia. We had questions this morning with regards to some of the challenges that we have in rural Nova Scotia. I think it's our job to step up to the plate and do what we can to help people create employment in this province.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton South on your final supplementary.
The Minister should tell that to Shaw in Cornwallis. He should give that same message he just gave me down to Shaw. Mr. Premier, or Mr. Speaker, I want to again on the second supplementary. The people of this province expect a government led by this Premier who will make investments which are in the best interests, and they expect a government and a Premier who is open and transparent, not a Premier and Cabinet who believes in censorship, secrecy, and dishonesty. Mr. Speaker, the people of this province deserve better. Mr. Premier, my question to the Premier. Would you advise that talking head over there to shut up?
Order! 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 The Honourable Member take his seat. We will not tolerate members asking another member to shut up in this legislature. It's unparliamentary language. The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Environment and Labour. Mr. Speaker, airborne emissions from Nova Scotia Power Generating Station in Trenton, number 5, are causing serious problems for residents in that town and in surrounding communities. Cars, decks, entire homes are often covered in fly ash. And the health and the properties of residents are being badly affected by this pollution. So my question through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, Madam Minister, how seriously is your department monitoring this public health crisis?
Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, NSBI at the Trenton Works plant is operating within their environmental approval. It is monitored on a regular basis. We will continue to work with the community, and as the community does see concerns, we ask them, we request them to bring them forward, and we will continue to investigate and make sure that they are acting within their environmental approval.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, I might point out it's not Trenton Works, it's the Trenton Generating Station owned by Nova Scotia Power. But, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia's emission standards here in this province are way below recently published WHO standards for air pollution. In 2010, the Canada-wide limits for fine particulate matter pollution, which has been known to be linked to lung cancer, pneumonia, and cardiovascular disease, will be 30 microns per cubic meter over a 24-hour period. And here in Nova Scotia, the standards are 120 microns per cubic meter over that same 24-hour period. In other words, our standards are 4 times the what will soon be the Canadian standards. Unacceptable here in this province. So my second question to the Minister is, what actions is your department taking to meet these new guidelines and to protect the health of Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Again, Mr. Speaker, the plant is operating within the parameters set down in the air pollutants strategy. They are in compliance. Issues that are raised by the community, we will continue to monitor to make sure that this company stays within compliance.
Honourable Member for Pictou West and your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since I seem to get nowhere here, I'm going to switch to the Minister of Health and ask his thoughts on this very serious issue. The residents of Trenton have been putting up with this serious problem of fly ash for decades. The incidence of cancer and heart disease and other health problems is very high in the area. Many people believe there's a link between these health problems and the diseases and deaths in the area. So my final question to the Minister of Health is, what action is your department taking to protect the health of the people in Trenton and in Pictou County?
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And this is all under the purview of Environment and Labour, and the Minister has really put forward the reasons why and how the function works. And I'll refer that to the Minister if she does have anything further to add.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll continue with my question before with the second supplementary question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, and I'll try to get through it this time without interruption, I hope. Mr. Premier, the people of this province expect a government who will make investments which are in the best interests, not only to Tory friends, they expect a government who is open and transparent and will make decisions in this place and in the cabinet rooms on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia and in the best interests of the people of Nova Scotia. Not a Premier who believes in censorship, secrecy, and dishonesty. Mr. Speaker, the people of this province deserve better. Mr. Premier, I'll ask one more time, Mr. Speaker, I'll ask of the Premier one more time, will you commit today to providing the full disclosure of the documents in question?
Order, please. The honourable member, the word to suggest dishonesty in the House is unparliamentary.
I'll retract that word, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Evasion may be a better word. Evading issues and evading information to the people of Nova Scotia. Conveniently forgetting, Mr. Speaker, to provide truthful documents when we're asked. Mr. Premier, I'll ask one more time of the Premier. Will you commit, Mr. Premier, today to providing the full disclosure of the documents in question to the people of Nova Scotia respecting S&J Potato Farms and Magic Valley? Will you do that, Mr. Premier?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, unlike the previous government, before we came into office in 1999, you stifled economic growth at every opportunity. This government has created over 40,000 jobs since coming to office in 1999. Mr. Speaker, this government had lowered taxes for the business community in our province. This government has made investments, wise investments, has attracted new companies here to our province, and we will continue to do that in the years ahead.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South. Next. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, my question's for the Minister of Environment and Labour. The public consultation period on the management plan of the Tobiatic Wilderness ended 2 years ago, and the implementation of the plan since then has been nothing more than promise after promise, delay after delay. And the Mayor of Queens had it right when he said it's really a case of paralysis through analysis. And this past February, the predecessor of the minister offered a program for dismantling campsite leases. When this minister took over, though, one of her very first moves was to delay that decision until the 31st of October of this year. Mr. Speaker, this plan has already been studied. It already has shown wide support, and it's been on the minister's desk for 2 years, since June of '04. Why will the government not implement the Tobiatic plan as written?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this minister did not delay until October 31st. This minister gave a final commitment that they would have a Tobiatic plan in place by October 31st. The campsite lease plan was not delayed. It was extended to give those individuals, the opportunity to see what that management plan will say before having to commit to a decision.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Atlantic on her first supplementary.
Okay. I'm not going to extend that particular line of questioning. The government promised, in a different move, it promised that in Section 34 of the Off-Highways Vehicles in Nova Scotia Provincial Direction and Action Plan that it would amend the Wilderness Areas Protection Act. The same commitment was made in the December '05 Green Plan. Also, in a letter from the former Minister of Environment and Labour to the Ecology Action Centre, he stated he would amend the Wilderness Protection Act. However, I have just received on my desk a letter from the new Minister of Environment in which she tells me that no additional amendments to the Act are being considered. I will table all of these documents. But, Mr. Speaker, with all the commitments made by this government to amend the Wilderness Areas Protection Act, why does this minister now state that she refuses, or at least will not, bring forward any legislation to make those previous promises reality?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, under the Wilderness Areas Protection Act, we feel that we have the authority in there to implement what needs to be implemented at this point in time. The Off-Highway Vehicle Act did reference those details, and we will continue to be committed to the release of the Tobeatic Draft Management Plan on October 31st.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Atlantic on her final supplementary.
I appreciate the commitment to commit yourself, the minister's commitment to commit herself. However, since taking over this portfolio, there has also been a consistent commitment to turn back on progress made by the department towards the implementation of the Tobeatic Management Plan and to better protect the wilderness areas. Consultation took place because there was already a known deficiency in the existing legislation. Right. The predecessor committed, in fact, to change that legislation as requested and committed not to issue more permits for off-highway vehicle use in protected wilderness areas. Mr. Speaker, I am confused. My question, therefore, is what is this government's position on the issuing of permits to allow recreational use of off-highway vehicles in protected areas?
Yeah. The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, when the campsite lease plan was...
The time allotted for question period has expired. Oh. The Honourable Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Aquaculture. On an introduction.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the East Gallery, I'd like to draw the attention to you and all members of the House. We have with us the Warden of Richmond County, Mr. Richie Cotton. We also have Chuck Boudreau, who's the principal of Antigonish High School in Antigonish County. And I'm also told, Mr. Speaker, that he is going to be go for nomination for the PC party in the county of Richmond. I'd ask everybody to welcome Mr. Boudreau.
I'd like to welcome all members to the gallery today. Government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, would you please call the order of business public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 1, the Protection from Illegal Drugs Act?
Bill number 1, Protection from Illegal Drugs Act. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased today to rise on second reading of Bill number 1, Protection from Illegal Drugs Act. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are growing increasingly concerned about the impact of illegal drugs on our communities and especially on our youth throughout Nova Scotia. The development and distribution of illegal drugs and the resulting crime has also led to increasing concern among law enforcement and its communities as well. Mr. Speaker, this legislation will allow us to tackle crime, providing more tools to help make Nova Scotia's communities safer. The Protection from Illegal Drugs Act will allow government to regulate the following: storage, transportation, distribution, and sale of ingredients, materials, and equipment used in the production and use of illegal drugs. While we have yet to see the significant instance of crystal meth in our province, it is very much on the radar. At the same time, we have seen the impact other illegal drugs have had on our communities across Nova Scotia. This legislation allows us to put in place very strict controls. For example, Mr. Speaker, the bill requires people to notify authorities if they become aware of the loss or theft of certain ingredients, materials, or equipment. This kind of information is critical to law enforcement and their duties. Mr. Speaker, we also know that sometimes children are put at risk by those involved in the illegal drug trade. Under this legislation, people will also be required to notify authorities if there's reason to believe that the health or safety of any child has been or is at risk from the production, manufacture, growth, or use of illegal drugs. Mr. Speaker, this legislation will put serious penalties in place for those involved in the illegal drug trade. Conviction of a first offense will result in a fine of $2,000 for an individual or $10,000 for a corporation. Fines for per second, and subsequent offences increased to 10,000 and 50,000 subsequently. This, of course, will be in addition to any criminal code charges that may be laid as a result of the offence. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is an important step, and we know other measures are needed to fight against illegal drugs. We know it's a cooperative approach, and this is clearly shown by the work that's been done in Cape Breton against illegal prescription drugs, which is a good example for us to follow the rest of the province. To that end, we're working with law enforcement and other key partners to create a comprehensive drug strategy tailored to meet the needs of Nova Scotians. This new legislation will support that effort.
Yes.
The strategy that we develop will be focused on prevention, enforcement, reduction of harms, and treatment.
Yes.
Partner departments include justice, health promotion, protection, community services, and education.
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, a great deal of work is underway to prevent and address illegal drug use in our province. A Nova Scotia drug strategy and new legislation will tie these efforts together, ensure that we're doing all we can to address our current needs and prevent the problems being experienced by other provinces. Yes. Mr. Speaker, I'm looking forward to support from the other parties in regards to this bill. And on that, Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of Bill number 1.
Hear, hear.
Recognize the honourable member for Coyle Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have a few moments to speak on Bill number 1. I'll set the record straight immediately. Yes, he'll have the support of the party that has been pushing for this very issue for at least 6 months, if not longer. Mr. Speaker, this is an issue that clearly, for once, it's an opportunity to be proactive before a drug comes into this province. Crystal methamphetamine is a very serious drug. Not that there's any illicit drugs that aren't serious, Mr. Speaker, but this is one that most people who have dealt with this drug will tell you that within even one or only two uses of the drug, you become addicted. Unlike cocaine and other amphetamines and speed, Mr. Speaker, where it can take longer, this drug is so powerful and the high is so long that the addiction is almost immediate. And I think the other part that is important about crystal meth that I think particularly should be of note to the Tories in this House and all the members who represent rural Nova Scotia, but because they have so many of them over on that side, Mr. Speaker, is that this is a drug that isn't necessarily it does have an impact in urban areas, but historically, and if you look at how it has impacted in Western North America, it is rural communities in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Montana, Oregon, Washington. These are places where rural communities particularly have been desperately hit by crystal meth, Mr. Speaker. It's a drug that does not come in through the front door like most other drugs where you see maybe on downtown streets or the impact in urban centers. This is a drug its impact is most directly hit in rural communities. Now, I would suggest to you that in Nova Scotia, like a lot of other places in Canada and North America, we are inadequately prepared to deal with a drug that has such a severe impact in rural areas. Our infrastructure for drug addiction, for drug awareness, for education is almost all based in urban communities where we think we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck. It's rural communities that are going to have the impact. They're going to be devastated by this and where they do not have the infrastructure. And my greatest concern about this bill, notwithstanding the fact that it was clearly drafted in a matter of hours before the House was brought in, Mr. Speaker, because compared to every other justice or even other government bills, Mr. Speaker, this one is very thin on details. Very, very thin on details. But, Mr. Speaker, one thing that is missing, and that is what we've been asking for, is in fact, I think we have a sister bill to this one that does lay this out, would provide a task force that would be meeting regularly and would identify the people that would be involved. This is not just an issue for police officers. Yes, they have a key role to play as enforcing the law. But, Mr. Speaker, there are people on the ground. Direction 180 here in Halifax. I'm sure there are many others in the province who are directly dealing with drug addictions on the street level, Mr. Speaker, and they need to have their voices heard as this bill is being introduced in the House and throughout. Past this bill, when this bill is passed, Mr. Speaker, an opportunity for them to be there meeting with people, professionals like themselves, who are seeing the impact of this drug on a daily and weekly and monthly basis, Mr. Speaker. They need to be there. The people that are working on the streets with the addicts, people from drug awareness, people, and I'm not talking about high-level people, Mr. Speaker. I'm talking about people who are working with the addicts on a regular basis. They need to have their voice heard at this as well. That's why we think that's an important part to this bill. If and that's a big if, I know at this point, if this bill goes to law amendments, our caucus will be seeking some amendments to ensure that we entrench some form of advisory council that will reflect all those that should be at the table, Mr. Speaker, not just those that maybe sit behind a desk or pontificate, but those who are actually working on the issue on a regular basis. We need all those voices, those who can make the policy and those that know the impact on the ground, Mr. Speaker. And I'd be glad, since the government was so keen on taking our suggestion with regard to this bill, they'll hopefully also take our amendments as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My comments will be very brief on Bill number 1. Mr. Speaker, I believe this is very important legislation, but I find it unfortunate that I don't believe this legislation has any hope of seeing the light of day under this current session of the House. It's unfortunate that this bill would not be passed and be implemented so that it could actually be able to achieve its goals. So I have no intentions of wasting the time of this House speaking on a bill which I believe the government has absolutely no intentions of actually passing during this sitting. So maybe if it comes up again on another day with an administration that actually plans on passing the bill, I would have further comments at that point. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The motion is for, I'll recognize the Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable members for their comments and certainly want to take into consideration suggestions by the honourable members opposite. And with that, I move second reading of Bill number 1, Protection from the Illegal Drug Act.
Motion is for second reading of Bill number 1. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 1, an act to combat the production and use of illegal drugs.
I order this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. Recognize the Honourable Minister of Transportation Public Works. Acting Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would you call for second reading Bill number 4, Safer Communities and Neighbourhoods Act?
Bill number 4, and I'll recognize the Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it gives me great pleasure again to rise on Bill number 4, Safer Communities and Neighbourhoods Act. Mr. Speaker, I expect as well that this is a bill I hope that will receive the support of all sides of the House. Again, it's a bill that goes to making our communities safer and stronger. We know that today Nova Scotians are very concerned about rising crime throughout this province. A big part of our Nova Scotia way of life is a feeling of safety and security in communities throughout this province. Mr. Speaker, we are working to support law enforcement in their efforts to tackle crime. At the same time, there's a role for communities to play, and this bill gives them a tool to take action against criminal behavior in their communities wherever it is in this province. Under the Safer Communities and Neighbourhoods Act, complaints from community members can result in court orders to close locations that are home to prostitution or illegal liquor, drugs, or gaming. These are activities that are very detrimental to healthy communities and their ability to survive. The Act also allows people to register their concerns about buildings that are unusually fortified, buildings that are often home to illegal activities. To implement this work, a new investigative unit is being established. This team will follow up on complaints and work with community members on their concerns. Under legislation, if a court is satisfied that certain activities are a serious and immediate threat to public safety, it can order that the property be closed and remain closed for up to 90 days. The court can also order individuals to stay away from the property and set many other conditions. Owners can also be held liable for any cost to close a property in the interest of public safety. Mr. Speaker, this act allows communities in the new investigative unit to work together with law enforcement to push criminal activity out of their neighborhoods and away from their families. This public safety initiative is working in other provinces, and it will complement successful measures already undertaken by our local and provincial policing partners. Mr. Speaker, these tools go hand in hand with other provincial action to address crime and improve the safety of Nova Scotians. With that, Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of Bill number 4.
Recognize the honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have a few minutes to speak on Bill number 4, or is it number 2? Thank you. And I'll start by saying you're welcome to the Minister of Justice, but I want to go into some detail on this particular piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. This is legislation as well, like the last piece, where this is something our caucus has been promoting for a while. In fact, I believe the province that has passed this legislation is an NDP government in Manitoba. So this is a piece of legislation that has a long history affiliated with the NDP, and one that I'm glad to have an opportunity to speak on today. Because this is one of the tools. When the NDP talks about the need to be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime, Mr. Speaker, this is one of those tools that addresses that need. When the NDP talks about the fact that we need more community-based policing, this piece of legislation is one of the tools that helps create a better sense of community safety, but also by having police forces working with community members to help identify these locations, to help identify these places that are consistently the location where we have problems with illegal activity, Mr. Speaker. Those are the locations that we need to address, whether because it's owned by a negligent property owner who leases the land or rents the house on a piece of land to anyone who may want to come and is willing to look the other way and not ask any question and is willing to allow them to continue their illegal activity. And when one is removed, someone else rents it. Or maybe it's owned by a particular criminal syndicate, Mr. Speaker, or maybe not a syndicate, but somewhat organized. And they have an opportunity when 2 or 3 people who get arrested at the bottom level of that organization, 3 or 4 more will come in and operate the same activity, Mr. Speaker. This is the problem we have in our communities. Communities that are unable to address this problem. This doesn't solve all the problems with regard to community safety, and the Minister of Justice, as a former police officer, should know that. This is one component that we're trying to address with this legislation. One component that will ensure that Nova Scotians who see a problem in their communities have trouble closing down these locations, or they close them down only to see them opening the next day or a week later as the same sort of outfit, the same sort of criminal activity, or maybe slightly different or greatly different activity, have an opportunity to shut these locations down permanently, Mr. Speaker, or at least for an extended period of time so that the criminal activity will not continue. This is one thing, as I said, is one tool to promote community-based policing. It's one tool to ensure that we are being tough on criminals and criminal activity, Mr. Speaker. This is not a panacea that will solve crime in our province. Will not ensure that a province that has become, and a city that has become the most violent in Canada under the tutelage of this particular government, Mr. Speaker. They have a lot more to do with regard to this issue than they're doing. And in fact, it's pretty clear that the only vision they have is to usurp the legislation that's being promoted by the opposition. I'm glad, like anyone, to see this legislation pass, because I think it's good for Nova Scotia in the long run, but it would be nice to see some vision from this government, Mr. Speaker, some vision that identifies their own way of looking at justice issues in this province. And Mr. Speaker, I do want to talk a bit about some of the substance with regard to the principles of this legislation. For example, we heard in today's budget, Mr. Speaker, that this government is looking at, I think it was $400,000 or $450,000 to create a special investigation unit in the Department of Justice to implement and enforce this legislation. I can't think of something that would be more of a serious problem than creating another police force in this province that thinks it has the power to go out and do investigations. The whole point of this legislation, Mr. Speaker, is to build relationships between the municipal police forces and the communities. Those police forces are the ones that know their communities. They know the people in their communities. They're the ones who can talk to them and are talking to them on a regular basis. And if they're not, they should be. This should be a tool to ensure we have much closer connection between communities and our police forces. But instead, this government is talking about creating a special provincial investigative unit that will be doing the enforcing of this legislation. So instead of someone in a community that sees a problem, maybe they see a house across the street where there's a lot of traffic in the middle of the night, or maybe they see a place where there's, they can sense or think that, or even eventually can prove that there's illegal activity. Instead of calling their local police department, instead of picking up the phone and talking to Constable Joe, who they know and they want to talk to, this government is going to use this legislation to create some sort of special provincial-based investigative unit, Mr. Speaker. That investigative unit probably will be based right here in downtown Halifax. I find it quite ironic that a government that likes to always take shots at HRM, or a government that likes to promote itself as being the one that reflects rural values, Mr. Speaker, is the one that's going to create a special investigative unit, most likely based in Halifax, that is going to be used to enforce this legislation. They're going to step on the toes. They're going to be getting in the way and interfering with the local police activity by moving in themselves to try and deal with this. Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't understand what the basis of that is. Why not provide those powers to the local police forces? If you want to have special investigators, they're going to work with them, fine. But to create a special investigative unit, Mr. Speaker, is only going to create a bureaucratic mess in this province with regard to justice. Indeed, I would argue it's going to create more problems than it will actually solve, because you're going to have special investigative units trying to do the job that should be done by municipal police forces. And we all know when you have that problem, you have problems of harmonization or lack thereof. You have problems of lack of communication. I mean, we've seen, I'm thinking about in New York City recently, Mr. Speaker, where post 9/11, there were recommendations for the fire department in New York and the police department in New York to actually have one communication system. They still haven't solved that post 9/11. I can only imagine the communications problems we're going to have between this special investigative unit at the provincial level and the municipal police forces. Many of those forces, as the minister will quite well know, having coming from one, are smaller units that don't necessarily have the manpower, but clearly they should be the lead organization. If they need backup support, we have in this province a system where the RCMP has specialized units, dive units or criminal investigation units, and when there is a crime in communities controlled by the RCMP, Mr. Speaker, they bring in those people. That's the way it should be done. But my fear is with these investigative units, we're going to create a new level of bureaucracy, a new police force that's going to feel it has not only the right but the power to do the enforcing, and that's going to create some serious problems in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, again, this is about being tough on crime and being tough on the causes of crime. And what this government has tried to do, even though clearly statistically they haven't had much success, is they're trying to sound like they're being tough on crime. And they're doing it by taking legislation that we've been proud to introduce, proud to promote, whether it's crystal meth regulation or whether it's this and other legislation about joyriding for people who, stricter sentences for people who joyride under the Motor Vehicle Act, Mr. Speaker. This is all legislation that my party has put forward because we believe it's good for Nova Scotia. We're more than glad to have this legislation passed, if it will be passed in this session, Mr. Speaker. But let us be clear, there's no vision on how we're going to bring down the numbers with regard to violent crime in Nova Scotia, with regard to Halifax, some of the most serious numbers in Canada. And this government will probably try, as the former Minister of Justice tried to do, blame this on the Youth Criminal Justice Act. But I think it's important to note that the same Youth Criminal Justice Act that's here in Nova Scotia is in Vancouver or in Whitehorse or in other cities in this country that do not have the most highest rates of violent crime in Canada. So don't blame the Youth Criminal Justice Act, because it's the same act that applies across the country. Yes, it's part of the problem. But clearly there's something else going on in Nova Scotia beyond the Youth Criminal Justice Act that's making this city, this province, more violent every day, Mr. Speaker. And this government, in its budget and in this bill, is not providing with any clear vision of how they intend to address those issues. How are we going to ensure that the causes of crime are being addressed? Throwing some subsidies at landlords so they can build a few houses, Mr. Speaker, or building public housing that's reflecting the needs of the communities in this province? Mr. Speaker? Is it about ensuring a few dollars here and there for businesses that have particular interests, Mr. Speaker? Or is it ensuring that we have recreational facilities, that we have infrastructure in place so that the youth in this province have an opportunity to choose positive alternatives when they're youth and not only negative ones, Mr. Speaker? I come from a part of this province. It's a burgeoning community. It's 13,000 people. It's one of the fastest growing communities in Nova Scotia, has a very large youth population. Our community is starting to solve those problems on our own, and we've had very little help from the provincial government. Frankly, the municipal and federal government seem to be the leaders in this. I would like to see a government, Mr. Speaker, that's prepared to show to the people of Nova Scotia that, yes, we've got a problem with violence. We've got a problem with youth that don't have the services they require. We've got a problem not only with crime, but with a lack of vision with regard to the causes of crime, Mr. Speaker. This government isn't prepared to do that. This government has not been prepared to provide that leadership role. They're more likely to blame the federal government, push down to the municipalities, Mr. Speaker, but have not shown any leadership. It's taking communities on their own that are willing to pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and address a problem that needs to be addressed. I don't call that leadership, Mr. Speaker. I don't call this government a leader with regard to criminal with addressing crime, addressing the causes of crime, and ensuring that we're no longer the most violent city in this country, that we're no longer a province with an increasing rate of violent crime, but that we're a province that's actually going to do something to ensure that youth in this province and adults in this province who are leaning towards criminal activity are going to have the opportunities to succeed, and when they do commit a crime, we're going to have a province that's going to get tough with them, Mr. Speaker. I don't see that with regard to this government. This piece of legislation is one tiny piece of that, a piece that's very important, a piece that will ensure that we will have safer communities if we allow the municipal police forces to do their job. But this government, without that vision, without that coordination, and instead just pointing the finger at other levels of government, Mr. Speaker, are unable and unwilling to actually follow through. They're able to copy. They're clearly able to photocopy. They're able to take our bill from last year and put it through the photocopier pretty well. I'll give them credit for that. But I don't see the leadership that's going to result in us actually addressing the chronic problems we have in this province, both on the causes of crime, whether it's poverty, lack of recreational facilities, Mr. Speaker, an education system that's unwielding to those that have special needs, whether that be behavioral, intellectual, learning disability, Mr. Speaker. These are problems that are faced in our province, and this is a government that's unwilling to address those and is unwilling to address the needs both on the causes of crime and the fact that we need to address criminal activity as well, Mr. Speaker. And it's that lack of vision that is most disturbing to me. But I may have more words on this, Mr. Speaker, so I'm going to move adjournment of debate.
Motion is for adjournment of debate. For reading of, is agreed? Agreed. Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I quite honestly have forgotten, but I believe that at this time we adjourn the House before we go into the emergency debate. So in that case, Mr. Speaker, I move that the House do now rise to meet again on the morrow. The business for the day for tomorrow, Mr. Speaker,